February 21st, 1969. Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakh SSR. Temperature minus 15 degrees Celsius. Wind 25 knots. Visibility clear. The wind on the steppe does not blow. It scours. It strips the warmth from skin and the paint from steel. Rising from this frozen desolation stands a cathedral of aluminum and ambition. The N-1 rocket. It is a 105-meter-tall totem to the Soviet state religion, the belief that dialectical materialism can conquer gravity. Inside the launch control bunker, the air is thick with the smell of stale tobacco and nervous sweat. Chief designer Vasily Mishin stands before the telemetry monitors, looking at the beast his predecessor, the legendary Sergei Korolev, had dreamt into existence. To the Politburo, the N-1 is a weapon of prestige, the vehicle that will plant the red banner on the Sea of Tranquility before the Americans can cycle the airlocks on their Eagle lander. To the engineers, it is a mathematical gamble of staggering proportions. The Americans build with a sledgehammer, Mishin remarks, gesturing to the intelligence reports on the Saturn V. 5 engines, 5 giant crude buckets of kerosene. They rely on brute force because they lack the finesse for complexity. The Soviet High Command laughs. It is a dry, hollow sound. They look at the diagrams of the American F-1 engine and see primitive engineering. The Americans use a gas generator cycle, dumping exhaust overboard, wasting precious thrust. It is inefficient. It is wasteful. It is typical of the capitalist obsession with excess. The Soviets, by contrast, have embraced the staged combustion cycle, a closed loop of terrifying efficiency where every gram of propellant is squeezed for maximum energy. They mistook complexity for superiority. The Soviet inability to manufacture large throat combustion chambers forced them into a corner. They could not build an engine powerful enough to lift the stack alone. Instead, they chose the cluster approach. 30 NK-15 engines arranged in a concentric ring at the base of the rocket. 30 turbopumps. 60 preburners. A hydrodynamic nightmare requiring thousands of feet of plumbing to feed a synchronized fire. The paper tiger theory is pervasive here. The generals believe the Saturn V is a fragile giant, prone to catastrophic failure if just one of its massive hearts misses a beat. They believe the N-1 is invincible because of the Cord system, an automated control unit designed to shut down any failing engine and increase thrust to the others to compensate. They view the rocket as a living organism, capable of healing its own wounds in mid-flight. They see safety in numbers. They see redundancy. Fuel pressure rising, oxidizer lines chilling. Cord system active. But looking at the base of the rocket, the sheer density of the engineering creates a sense of vertigo. It does not look like a propulsion system. It looks like the inside of a pipe organ designed by a madman. There is no room for error. There is no space for a wrench, let alone a vibration. The Americans spent years testing their stages on static stands, screaming fire into the concrete until the metal yielded its secrets. The Soviets, rushing to beat Kennedy's deadline, have skipped the static tests. They are testing the entire assembly, all 30 engines, for the first time on the flight that is supposed to take them to the moon. There is no luck. There is only superior physics. As the countdown clock ticks toward 0, the engineers in the bunker convince themselves that the Cord system is a digital watchman. They do not realize that they have not built a rocket. They have built a hydrodynamic bomb. And the Cord system is not the safety switch. It is the detonator. July 3rd, 1969. T-minus 10 seconds. Valve status, open. Ignition sequence commit. Heart rate 140 BPM. The silence of the steppe is not broken. It is annihilated. The ignition of the N-1 is not a singular event. It is a cascading sequence of 30 distinct, violent acts. At the base of the rocket, the Block A stage erupts. 30 NK-15 engines arranged in a tight, claustrophobic ring begin to scream. The noise is beyond human endurance. It is a physical wall of pressure that flattens the grass for miles. In the bunker, the coffee in the cups doesn't ripple, it vaporizes into mist from the ultrasonic vibration. The concrete floor, 3 meters thick, hums like a tuning fork. The beast is awake. And it is angry. For the first few seconds, the illusion holds. The clamp arms retract. The massive gray tower, painted in the utilitarian white and green of the Soviet military, begins to heave upward. It is sluggish. Reluctant. The thrust-to-weight ratio is razor-thin. Unlike the Saturn V, which leaps off the pad with a triumphant roar, the N1 claws its way into the sky, fighting for every inch. The physics of a cluster launch are terrifyingly unstable. The exhaust plumes from 30 engines do not simply exit, they interact. They collide. They create a base vacuum, a low-pressure zone that tries to suck the fire back up into the engine bay. The acoustic energy reflecting off the concrete launch pad creates a shock diamond lattice capable of shattering welds. The rocket is vibrating not just mechanically, but acoustically. It is being screamed apart. T plus 6 seconds, altitude 100 meters. The rocket clears the lightning towers. To the generals watching through the periscopes, it looks like victory. They see the fire. They feel the power. They are already drafting the telegram to Moscow. They are witnessing the triumph of Soviet mass over American complexity. But inside the engine bay, a microscopic tragedy has begun. Sensor 244 oxygen pump inlet. Reading anomaly. Status debris ingestion. It wasn't a missile. It wasn't sabotage. It was a metallic foreign object, perhaps a loose bolt, perhaps a diaphragm fragment, floating in the liquid oxygen line feeding engine number 8. At 0.2 seconds past the 10-second mark, that fragment hits the impeller of the turbopump. The pump is spinning at 10,000 RPM. The impact is catastrophic. The impeller disintegrates. The casing shatters. Liquid oxygen, colder than the dark side of the moon, sprays onto the white-hot turbine blades. The engine does not just fail, it detonates. A fireball erupts inside the engine skirt. This is the moment the Cord system was designed for. The analog computer detects the pressure drop in engine 8. Its logic gates click. It issues the command to shut down engine 8. To keep the rocket balanced, it also sends a command to shut down the opposing engine on the other side of the ring. It is a sound theory. In a textbook, it works perfectly, but electricity travels faster than hydraulics. The fire from the exploding engine 8 has already melted the insulation off the control wires running to the other engines. The 1,000-degree plasma is short-circuiting the nervous system of the rocket. The Cord system receives a phantom voltage spike, a scream of electrical noise that it interprets as a catastrophic failure of the entire cluster. Cord logic error. Signal critical. Action emergency shutdown. Scope all engines. The Cord system panics. It effectively commits suicide. In a desperate bid to save a machine that is already dead, the computer sends the shutdown command to 29 of the 30 engines. The roar stops. The silence that follows is heavier than the noise. For a heartbeat, the N1 hangs suspended in the air, 200 meters above the pad. A 4,000-ton skyscraper, stripped of its legs. Gravity, the patient nemesis, reasserts its claim. The rocket does not tip over. It does not spiral. It simply falls backward. Straight down. It was as if the hand of God simply let go. One telemetry officer would later whisper, "We saw the fire go out, and then we saw the shadow of the rocket grow larger on the ground. The impact is registered on seismographs in Denver, Colorado. When the N1 hits a concrete pad, it is fully fueled. It carries 2,300 tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen. The mixture ignites instantly. The explosion is calculated at approximately 7 kilotons of TNT. This is not an industrial accident. It is a small tactical nuclear weapon without the radiation. The fireball expands at supersonic speed. The shock wave is visible, a rapidly expanding sphere of compressed air that pulverizes concrete into dust before the sound even arrives. Thermal radiation, 3,000 degrees Celsius. Blast radius, 6 miles. Windows shattered 40 kilometers away. The launch complex. The culmination of a decade of labor, the pride of the Soviet Union, is erased. The two lightning towers, massive steel structures, are twisted into pretzels. The grasshopper service gantry is vaporized. The underground bunkers, designed to withstand air raids, heave like ships in a storm. The armored glass of the viewing ports cracks. On the steppe, the wildlife dies instantly. The birds are knocked from the sky. The grass burns. Inside the bunker, the men are thrown to the floor. The lights die. The emergency red strobes flicker to life, illuminating faces that have gone pale with the realization of their doom. They are not coughing from smoke yet. They are gasping from the vacuum created by the fire, consuming all the oxygen in the immediate atmosphere. The moon is gone. The dream is ash. As the dust settles, a terrible silence returns to Baikonur. The crater is massive. The twisted remains of the N1 lie in a heap of smoking ruin. There is no triumphant broadcast. There will be no parade in Red Square. There is only the crackle of cooling metal and the smell of burning kerosene, thick and oily, coating the lungs of the survivors. The generals look at the screens, now displaying only static. They turn to the engineers. They want answers. They want to know why their unstoppable cluster failed. They want to blame a saboteur. They want to blame a soldier. They do not understand that they were defeated by concepts they refused to acknowledge. They were not beaten by bad luck. They were beaten by the chaotic mathematics of 30 screamers trying to sing in harmony. They built a monster, and the monster turned on its creators. Status mission failure. Casualties, data redacted. Launch complex destroyed. Edwards Air Force Base, California. The Ridge. Thrust, 1.5 million pounds. Acoustic load, 170 decibels. Status stable. While the Soviets were sweeping up the radioactive dust of their lunar ambitions in Kazakhstan, a different kind of violence was being enacted in the Mojave Desert. To understand why the N1 was doomed before it ever left the drawing board, you must look into the throat of the beast, the combustion chamber of the American F-1 engine. The Soviets had looked at the physics of a giant rocket engine and concluded it was impossible. They believed that as you scale up a combustion chamber, the instability monster becomes unbeatable. They were almost right. "It screams," a Rocketdyne engineer noted in 1964. "It doesn't burn. It screams, and then it eats the metal." This was the technological chasm. The Soviets, terrified of this instability, chose the cluster strategy. 30 small, safe, proven engines. It was a cowardly engineering decision disguised as innovation. They traded the difficulty of combustion physics for the impossibility of plumbing logistics. The Americans, conversely, decided to stare directly into the sun. They would not build 30 engines. They would build 5. But to do that, they had to solve the most difficult problem in rocketry: combustion instability. When you inject kerosene and liquid oxygen into a chamber that is nearly 4 feet wide, you are not creating a fire. You are creating a continuous explosion. In a chamber that size, the pressure waves don't just exit the nozzle. They bounce off the walls. They reflect. If the frequency of these bouncing waves matches the resonant frequency of the burning fuel, you get a coupler. The waves amplify each other. The pressure spikes from 1,000 psi to 3,000 psi in milliseconds. The heat transfer to the injector face jumps by 400%. The metal doesn't melt. It is scoured away like sand in a sandblaster. For years, the F-1 was a failure. It would run for 2 seconds, develop a rotary detonation wave, a ghost spinning inside the fire, and then explode. The arrogant Titan assumed the Americans would give up and switch to clusters too. But the wizards at Rocketdyne, men like Paul Castenholtz and Dan Clute, didn't switch tactics. They stopped trying to predict the fire and started trying to cage it. Component, the injector plate. Material, copper alloy. Holes, 3,700. The solution was not a computer chip. It was not a laser. It was a piece of plumbing so complex it bordered on art. The coaxial injector plate. Imagine a showerhead the size of a dining room table. It has nearly 3,700 holes. But they aren't just holes. They are angled tuned pairs. One jet shoots fuel, the other shoots oxygen. They are aimed to collide at a precise mathematical point in space, millimeters from the face of the plate. They atomized the fuel before the fire could touch it. But atomization wasn't enough. The screaming ghost was still there, bouncing off the walls, waiting to shatter the engine. The engineers needed a way to stop the acoustic waves from organizing into a shock front. They needed to put walls inside the fire. This was the baffle breakthrough. The engineers installed rigid copper blades sticking up from the face of the injector plate, arranged in concentric rings and radial spokes. To a layman, it looked like a waffle iron. To a physicist, it was a wave trap. When the transverse pressure waves tried to spin around the chamber to build up energy, they hit the copper baffles. The wave energy was physically blocked, shattered, and dissipated before it could resonate. The Soviets had the cord system, an electronic attempt to react to failure. The Americans had the baffle, a geometric structure that made failure physically impossible. One was an analog bandage, the other was a physics cure. But the wizards were not satisfied with theoretical stability. They had to be sure. They had to know that the F-1 wouldn't just work on a sunny day, but that it could survive a catastrophe and keep burning. So they did something that the Soviet engineers, paralyzed by the fear of their delicate N-1 plumbing, would never dare. They bombed their own engine. It was called Project Bomb. The engineers mounted a literal explosive charge, a small grenade, inside the combustion chamber of a running F-1 engine. Test number 504. Status running. Action, detonate charge. The engine is screaming at full power, generating 1.5 million pounds of thrust. The charge detonates. It creates an artificial instability, a massive, violent pressure spike designed to trigger the screaming ghost. It is an insult to the machine. It is an attempt to murder the engine in mid-flight. In a Soviet engine, this shock wave would have shattered the pumps and vaporized the rocket. Recovery time, 40 milliseconds. The F-1 engine swallowed the grenade. The baffles caught the shock wave, chopped it into incoherent noise, and forced the flow back into a stable burn in less than 1/10 of a second. The engine didn't just survive, it shrugged. We didn't just want it to work, a lead propulsion engineer said years later. We wanted to prove that even if God himself tried to blow it out, the F-1 would keep burning. This was the reveal. While the Soviets were knitting together a sweater of 30 fragile threads, hoping none would pull, the Americans had forged a single, solid steel shield. The F-1 was dynamically stable. It didn't need a computer to balance it. It didn't need a cord system to baby it. It was inherently, physically dominant. The difference was in the cycle. The Soviets used staged combustion, sending the exhaust from the pre-burner back into the main chamber. It preserved pressure, but it linked every system together. If one part sneezed, the whole engine caught a cold. The Americans used the gas generator cycle. They took the exhaust from the pump and threw it overboard. It was less efficient. It was messy, but it meant the main chamber was isolated from the pumps. It decoupled the system. The Soviet N-1 was a closed loop of hysteria, where a vibration in Pump 4 could destroy Engine 28. The Saturn V was a collection of 5 independent fortresses. As the smoke cleared at the ridge, the American engineers looked at the telemetry strips. The lines were flat. The vibration was negligible. They had tamed the hurricane. They realized then that the space race was not going to be won by the nation with the most brave pilots or the most political will. It was going to be won by the nation that understood fluid dynamics. The Soviets were fighting gravity. The Americans were mastering it. November 23, 1972, Baikonur Cosmodrome. April 11, 1970, Kennedy Space Center. System logic binary versus analog. Latency 0.1 milliseconds. Outcome divergent. The war was not fought with bullets. It was fought with hertz. It was a confrontation between 2 distinct nervous systems trying to control a controlled explosion. To understand why the Saturn V became a legend and the N-1 became a classified crater, we must look away from the fire and look at the brain. By 1972, the Soviets were desperate. They had rebuilt the launch pad. They had redesigned the engines. They were ready for launch number 4. They believed they had fixed the plumbing, but they had ignored the ghost in the machine. A rocket is like a rubber band, a guidance engineer once explained. You push it from the bottom, and the heavy weight is at the top. It wants to wobble. It wants to snap. If you don't stop the shaking breaks the pipes. This is the confrontation. It is the moment where the pogo effect, the lethal oscillation of fuel pressure, attacked both rockets. The difference in how they survived, or died, reveals the absolute technological chasm between the 2 superpowers. Altitude, 40 miles. Velocity, Mach 5. S2 stage ignition. The world remembers Apollo 13 for the explosion of the oxygen tank days later, but the mission nearly ended minutes after launch, in the atmosphere. During the burn of the second stage, the S2, the center J2 engine, began to vibrate. This was pogo. The thrust caused the structure to flex, which squeezed the fuel lines, which caused a pressure spike in the engine, which increased thrust, which flexed the structure more. It is a self-exciting loop. The vibration reached 34 Gs. The engine frame was flexing by 3 inches at 16 times per second. In a Soviet system, this would have been a death sentence. The Cord system, detecting a variance of this magnitude, would have panicked. It would have shut down the center engine. Then, adhering to its rigid symmetry logic, it would have looked for an opposing engine to shut down. But it was the center engine. There is no opposite. The logic loop would have encountered a singularity. In the confusion, the Cord likely would have shut down the entire stage or triggered the flight termination system. The Soviet logic was rigid. The American logic was adaptive. The Saturn V had a brain called the instrument unit, a massive ring 3 feet high and 21 feet in diameter, bolted between the third stage and the command module. Inside, it held a feral digital intelligence, IU status detecting anomaly. Action command cutoff, recalculation in progress. The instrument unit saw the pressure spike in the center engine. It didn't panic. It didn't try to shut down the other engines to balance the ship. It simply issued a kill command to the center J2 engine 2 minutes early. But then, the wizardry happened. The digital computer instantly recalculated the mission profile in real time. It realized the rocket was now underpowered. The computer didn't ask for permission. It just did the math. The IU sent a command to the remaining 4 engines: burn longer. It extended the burn time of the second stage by 34 seconds and the third stage by 9 seconds. It traded time for thrust. The astronauts barely noticed. The mission continued. The system absorbed the failure and converted it into a variable. Cut to Baikonur, 2 years later. The Soviets are launching the N-1 for the 4th time. They have installed a new version of the Cord system. They have added Freon fire suppression. They have added simplified plumbing. The rocket lifts off. It clears the tower. For 90 seconds, it looks like they have finally done it. The arrogant Titan begins to smile. The engines are roaring. The telemetry is green. T plus 106 seconds. Altitude 40 kilometers. Max Q passed. Then the Pogo arrives. The N-1 was long and thin, like a pencil. As the first stage burned off its fuel, the resonant frequency of the empty tanks shifted. At 106 seconds, a longitudinal shock wave began to ripple up and down the stack. It hit the oxidizer lines leading to the center's 6 engines. The pressure fluctuated wildly. The Cord system, still fundamentally an analog creature, saw the pressure fluctuation. But unlike the Saturn V's instrument unit, the Cord could not think. It could only react. It saw the fluctuation as a pump failure. It shut down the center's 6 engines instantly to prevent an explosion. The shock of the shutdown was worse than the vibration. When you slam 6 valves shut on a pipeline flowing at thousands of gallons per second, you create a water hammer effect. The pressure wave bounced back up the pipes, shattering the hydraulic lines and rupturing the oxidizer turbo pumps of the surrounding engines. The N-1 didn't just lose power, it had a heart attack. The structural stress of the sudden shutdown snapped the propellant lines. Kerosene poured into the engine bay. The fire started. Status: core failure. Structural integrity: 0%. Termination: automatic. At 40 kilometers up, the N-1 exploded. It was the final gasp of the Soviet moon program. They had tried to solve a physics problem with a switch. They had tried to tame the Pogo effect by simply telling the engine to stop. The Americans, understanding the technological chasm, had approached the problem differently. They knew they couldn't stop the vibration with a switch, so they used accumulators, gas-filled cavities in the fuel lines that acted like shock absorbers for the liquid oxygen. They softened the propellant. They changed the physics of the fluid itself. The Americans engineered the fuel. The Soviets fought the engine. The confrontation was over. The Saturn V had faced the exact same demons: vibration, instability, component failure. But the Saturn V was a fault-tolerant system. It assumed things would break and provided a digital path to survival. The N-1 was a fault-intolerant system. It assumed perfection, and when perfection cracked, the entire machine committed suicide. We watched the telemetry die, a Soviet controller wrote in his diary. And with it we watched the era end. We knew in that silence that the Americans hadn't just beaten us, they had out-evolved us. May 1974. The Kremlin, Moscow. Status program cancellation. Classification: top secret. Objective: erasure. The war did not end with a treaty. It ended with a welder's torch. Vasily Mishin was fired. In his place came Valentin Glushko, a man who had hated the N-1 from the moment it was sketched on a napkin. Glushko didn't just want to stop the program, he wanted to exercise it. He viewed the N-1 not as a tragedy, but as an engineering heresy, a tangled mess of plumbing that insulted the elegance of rocket science. The order came down from the Politburo: destroy it all. Asset N-1 Flight Article Number 5. Action: dismantle. Asset blueprints. Action: incinerate. At Baikonur, the massive launch gantries were cut down. The two fully assembled N-1 rockets, ready for future attempts, were dragged out of the assembly building and hacked apart. The giant spherical fuel tanks, marvels of metallurgy, were not recycled for other rockets. They were cut in half and dispersed into the surrounding villages to be used as roofs for pigsties and storage sheds. For decades, Western satellites would drift over the Kazakh steppe, photographing strange, circular structures in the mud, never realizing they were looking at the dismembered corpses of the Soviet moon dream. They buried their shame in the dirt. The Soviets scrubbed the N-1 from the encyclopedias. They denied it ever existed. When the Americans landed on the moon, the Soviet press claimed they had never been in a race at all. They claimed their focus was always on robotic probes and space stations. It was a lie, built to protect a fragile ego of a superpower that had been outthought, outspent, and out-engineered. But physics does not care about propaganda. The numbers, when finally declassified after the fall of the Iron Curtain, delivered the ultimate verdict. The Soviet N-1, 4 launches, 4 catastrophic failures. Success rate, 0%. The American Saturn V, 13 launches, 13 successes. Success rate, 100%. We thought we could compensate for a lack of technology with sheer will, a Russian propulsion expert admitted in the 1990s. But the Saturn V proved that you cannot cheat the energy density of a F1 engine. You either master the fire, or the fire masters you. The legacy of the N-1 is not just one of failure. It is a grim lesson in the danger of complexity bias. The Soviets believed that adding more engines, more pumps, and more control loops would create safety. They built a system so complex it became impossible to test. The Americans embraced elegance. They built a system that was massive, loud, and terrifying, but fundamentally simple. 5 big buckets, 5 big fires. A digital brain that could take a punch. Location, Smithsonian Air and Space. Artifact F1 engine. Status, eternal. Today, the F1 engines that lifted Apollo 11 still sit on the ocean floor, recovered by billionaires as trophies of a golden age. The surviving Saturn V's rest in museums, lying on their sides like sleeping dragons. You can walk under them. You can touch the cold metal of the nozzle extension. You can see the baffles that tamed the screaming ghost. The N-1 exists only in grainy classified footage and the rust of the Baikonur scrapyard. It is a ghost story told by engineers to frighten interns. It is the monument to the arrogant titan who thought he could argue with the laws of thermodynamics. The chasm was real, and the wrong side fell in. They built a wall of secrets to hide their failure. They never realized we would just engineer a way to fly over it. Subscribe for more stories from the chasm.